Since graduating, Greg has gone on to establish himself as a very creative, a phenomenal independent game designer and developer. And welcome, Greg, and thank you very much. All right, so we'll turn over.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to give my talk thing. This is pre-prepared slides and stuff, and you're going to have lots of time for questions afterwards. So this is timed for about 20 minutes. Hope it's okay. I might go through it really fast, but lots of times, yeah, for you to ask me stuff. So I'm going to try to stay in sync also with the slides here. Okay. Oh yeah, I can see you browsing the slides too. That's awesome. So I know where you are. Okay. So yeah, my talk is called Wandersong, a game about feelings. And then yeah, just go to the next slide. So okay. The first question on anyone's minds would be, what are feelings in the context of game design? How can a game be about feelings? And to kind of present that, next slide. I was going to talk about my other games and how they differed from Wandersong. So the core goal of a lot of my previous work, or I guess the core goal of games in general, like if you really take a step back, is usually to create some kind of engagement, right? So you'll design the complexity and difficulty curve and game mechanics in a way to try to keep the player interested. And you'll offer them experiences that are challenging, that are thoughtful, that are fun, that are epic. You want to kind of like guide them through this experience that, and just engage them, keeps them interested somehow. And then next slide. If the player has usually even most games, if the player has an emotional experience out of that, I mean, it's usually an encouraged side effect, but it's a secondary consideration to their basic engagement or interest. Which makes sense because keeping a player engaged in a game is a really hard problem already. And games don't really have to forge an emotional connection in order to be a fulfilling experience for players, right? So it's for a lot of people really satisfying just to play something that is just really thoughtful or interesting or exciting, or puzzling or thoughtful, and doesn't really matter if it's really emotional or not, right? But next slide. With Wandersong, over time, we found that our goal was to make the player feel shit. So we let that kind of goal take precedence over issues with complexity and difficulty curve. Like that goal kind of became the higher priority than those things. And what we did find is that by focusing on that aspect of the game, we found graceful solutions to other aspects of the game, like in the design and aesthetic. So the rest of the talk is going to be kind of like specific examples of that. So next slide. Oh, I see. This is the video. Hang on. I want to look at it so I make sure I'm looking at the right thing. Oh, this is a trailer for Wandersong. So I guess, yeah, you can watch that if you're not familiar with the game. That's probably a good jumping point. Cool. Okay. So that's just to kind of give you, hopefully, an idea of what the game looks like, I guess. Okay, next slide. Starting point. There's like a GIF on screen. There should be, and this is like the very first GIF I recorded of the game, just like a week or so after starting the project. Sort of one of the first decisions I made with this game. There's a lot of kind of decisions that are built into this already that I'm going to try to unpack a little bit. But one first obvious thing was the choice to make the game like side-scrolling. to emphasize like the motion. There are already a lot of choices about like what the kind of like color and vibe of the game were. So a lot of stuff was already kind of figured out. Oh wait, is that this right? Am I looking at the? Oh wait, hang on. I want to make sure I'm showing the right thing here. I'm worried that I have. No, okay, this makes sense. Okay. Okay. All right. So like the kind of like some. Okay, so next slide. Yeah, these are kind of like some first concept arts and other things that were related to the game. So like the art style was kind of based on Kirby's Epic Yarn. I think, yeah, I didn't see the GIF that was on the last slide, so now I'm worried that I like messed something up because my notes don't line up with what I'm showing, but I'm just gonna assume that that covers that. I just want to show you, basically show you like the early starting point of the game. So that's how it kind of, oh, I remember now. Okay. So in the previous slide, I realized now, okay, I should make it so I can play these videos. I got sidetracked. So it should be a video of a rainbow wheel over a gray circle, right? Okay, great. Okay. So before I'd figured out like the visual style. So yeah, within like the first week, it had like the side scrolling and like the platforming stuff. But even before that, like the very first, this is like the first hour. I didn't actually have this footage recorded. Like I had to actually go back and recreate this to show for this. But the first thought was basically just like, how do I turn a game controller into a musical instrument? So the game started as just like rainbow wheel floating over a gray void. And I basically just tried to, I mapped it to a controller stick. I saw that it made fun little sounds. You are getting audio from that, right? So just this little thing, it was like super simple, super dinky, but already from this kind of like core idea, I kind of felt like this is actually really, really fun to play with. And from there, I started to get ideas about like, okay, so like what kind of game could I shape around that? This felt like a really strong basis, and that's how I went from that to the art style decisions about like how the game kind of looked and felt. It was all kind of came from this like, starting idea of just like something about making music, and that being kind of like a really fun starting point idea. Yeah. Okay. So then the next slide showed the first concepts. Sorry that I messed up that slide order. So those are like the first art concepts, and then the next slide is unpacking a little bit about, yeah. So right off the bat, like one thing that I kind of knew from that concept art was that the character was going to be a really big part of the experience of the game. I really wanted the player to kind of like connect with their avatar character. So I made a conscious decision to make the character really big on the screen. So this is a really obvious distinction, right? Like compared to a game like Hollow Knight, where it's really exploration based, the character takes up like nothing at all. Whereas on our screen, actually, like the bard's face is like a sizable actual like percentage of the screen space. And that means that when their expression changes, like it reads really easily, it becomes really obvious. And there were some constraints that came with this. So like, the screen is really like the camera's really close, so it's actually really hard for the player to see a lot of space around the character. That makes some things really challenging in terms of level design, where a game like Hollow Knight actually has a lot of affordances, like you can see a lot more. But I actually feel that because of that constraint, I was motivated to actually make level designs that were a lot like clearer and small scoped. So like in every small little space, you always see relevant information guiding you forward. It is really easy to keep to like you never lose the character on the screen basically. They're really huge, so even players who aren't super game savvy, it's actually quite easy for them to like keep track of where the bard is, which is I think even especially important for our game because the color design is just so ridiculous and everything is so loud and grabbing your attention. It's really helpful that the character is just really big and obvious compositionally. Okay, so next slide. This one, okay, so this video kind of shows just some basic like interactions and animations of the character. So like one thing that was obvious, because that music wheel was always kind of like the thing I came back to, like kind of the funnest, most important thing to play with. So I wanted to make sure that the player always had access to that music wheel. Even when they're talking to characters, whatever they're doing, that music wheel is always kind of what the game is about, what you're doing. So I intentionally kind of designed the character and animated them in such a way that, no matter what you're doing, no matter how you play with them, it always kind of feels like it's in character, right? Like the character is like super goofy looking and just ridiculous. So even if you're in like a relatively serious scene and you just start singing and dancing at somebody, like it doesn't actually feel weird. It almost feels like, okay, yeah, they would do that, wouldn't they? Like it always kind of feels in character and always feels like you're playing the game that it's meant, the way it's meant to be, basically. Um, so if that video is done playing out, then you go to the next slide. Um, um, oh, I skipped a slide. Okay, so was it auto? Hang on, I'm screwing something up. Okay, so it was really important to me also to make the game feel really like spacious. I wanted you to kind of feel like you could go anywhere. Like I wanted to have this like exploration kind of feeling to it. But in practice, once I started laying out screens, I found that it was actually kind of difficult to do that. Like, so I was looking at other games, obviously, to kind of get context for how they do level design things, and I noticed that like the way a lot of games do this is they'll take place inside of caves or castles, really enclosed spaces. But the reason why they do that is because then they can put platforms all over the place and it doesn't feel out of place, right? Um, and that's useful because that makes level design more interesting. But for a game like Wandersong, where I wanted you to like see the sky and have this open space, that became really difficult. So next slide. You can see how the way I solved that problem was that I made these kind of like jump through platforms, and I did this like layering thing. So when you're standing on higher elevation platforms, you're also kind of moving into the background. And that way, it kind of like it made it so that basically the level design could be really varied. You'd have platforms all over the place in any kind of shape and direction. But then you always also can see the sky. You always feel like all this space, kind of breathing room around you. And then you also feel this sense of depth in 3D space as well as in 2D. So yeah, it makes the game feel really spacious and it keeps level design interesting, but not really like claustrophobic the way I think a lot of other platformer games feel. Uh, Next slide. So I actually built like a whole level editor for the game because I had a really specific vision for how I wanted kind of the shape of the levels to be. So this is what it looked like. I would just like click down points and make these shapes to draw solids. And the thinking behind this was that I wanted the game to basically have unique shapes in every scene. Um, like I wanted to have this kind of handcrafted feeling to it. I wanted to feel like it was always like made very personally. So I didn't want any patterns. I didn't want repetition. I didn't want tiles, anything like that. So this was kind of my solution for that. Like I made the system's actually relatively simple for building shapes, but very expressive. So I can make things that looked like anything basically, and I hand job your screen. In concept, it sounds like that should have been like a huge amount of work to actually basically hand draw every scene uniquely, but I made the design level editor around making that as simple as possible, and making it as fun for me as a designer, to make lots of content. So it didn't actually feel like an insane scope idea. And then yeah, it breathes unique life and like organic character into all the different scenes of the game. Um, so the next slide shows also my color palette tools. So, colors I knew were going to be hugely important to the game aesthetic. So the level editor was also designed around those in a really big way. Um, so the way it works basically is that every element in the game level, it actually references like a color ID instead of it doesn't have an actual color material. And so then there's just like a small set of colors that represent all the colors that are like in the game, or at least like in that kind of world. And then just by editing the colors on that palette, everything in the game like changes color. So if you go to the next slide, this one, like, it takes a few clicks to see all the different, there's like three different images here, but you can see basically how, like this, by having that color palette editor, I was able to iterate on the colors, and I actually could iterate on colors separately from level design. So I could like make a bunch of screens and then go back and be like, these colors aren't really working for me, and then go back and adjust the colors and then keep working on the levels. So that basically made it so that, I could focus on colors separately from other things. It helped me iterate on colors. It made it really easy to like improve the colors, and then everything would look better. And it really helped me, I guess, like hone in on the feeling of different areas of the game. So as I was developing things, I could go back and work on the colors. And yeah, even with like relatively little effort, like small tweaks, I can make really big changes that change the way visual parts, like the game looked visually. Yeah. So next slide. This is kind of like showing you just like different screenshots from across the game. You can see how like, there's different areas of the game have really, really drastically different color palettes. I actually used a shader to color grade the main character as well. So in different scenes of the game, like the color palette on the bard is also different to match the colors. So in essence, between the shapes and the colors and that shader and all the unique characters, like every single screen in the game, like every shape and every color on every screen is actually like uniquely chosen for that part of the game. And the impact of that is that, every scene feels unique. You really feel like the unique emotional experience of every screen. And I think it does a lot to kind of like give you a really broad feeling experience, right? Like, when a scene called for like a really specific kind of mood, I was able to do that. So those tools all really, really helped me kind of like approach the game from that perspective. So next slide. This is another video. This one shows kind of how we tied audio into that as well. So one thing I did was all the music in the game, like I would I would get the BPM basically from the musician, and everything in the game actually knows the BPM of the music and animates to the time of the music. So like the way that the grass and the flowers sway in the wind, the speed that the bird's wings flap, and the way it bobs and the way it goes left and right, like everything, even like the idle animation and the running animation for the player, they're actually subtly all retimed so they move to the beat of the music. And there's this really nice sense of harmony. Like everything kind of moves in time together. It's very like soothing feeling. Yeah. And then next slide. So this kind of shows some of our philosophy with the actual like challenge and game design. The way that, like there's no way really to make a game interesting without some kind of conflict or challenge. The way we approach some of that stuff is that, we always have something in mind, like something the players should do, and we advance them when they do the right thing, but we don't punish them when they do something wrong. A lot of games, usually when you do the wrong thing, they'll find some way to set you back or tell you you're wrong. We usually don't do that. We actually just try to wait very patiently for the player to basically keep trying until they get it right. So that way, like the game feels very, very low pressure. And we also build like a certain kind of trust with the player by doing that, right? They always know that when like singing always leads to progression. They're never going to sing and then the game's going to like tell them no, push them back, punish them, take away a life, whatever, right? You always know that like no matter what situation you're in, you can sing, you can try singing different ways, and one way or another, like you're going to pass the current challenge in front of you by doing that. So next slide. So because, and this is another video, because we build that trust with players, they'll intuitively sing at anything new they encounter in the game, and they see how that reacts. And I think in general, like it puts the player in actually a really comfortable and playful state of mind. They're really open and excited to see what comes next, not nervous or anxious in any kind of way. Like they're in a basically really nice state of flow. And that really sidesteps kind of a big design problem of making like a balancing challenge and making an interesting difficulty curve. The game isn't really based on difficulty curve at all. It's actually more just like a sequence, like a museum of playful interactions. And every little interaction, every little screen, every little thing you do, it's always satisfying and fun to play with just to see how it reacts with you. And it's never punishing. It just always feels good. It's just like, playing and having fun. So next slide. So this one has a little animation. Breaking the rules. So the most important thing, obviously, when you establish rules for how you interact with a player, what makes it really interesting is when you break those rules, and that really could change how a game can feel. So next slide. First example is a character, Miriam. So she shows up actually kind of early in the game. This is a video. So she actually has kind of a surprising and very negative reaction when you sing to her. And it creates a really fun comedic moment with her, but it also establishes her character and a relationship with the bard really, really quickly, right? Like the fact that she's so like she's presents such a contrast to the way the rest of the game reacts to you that she really gets your attention. She really stands out. Her actions with the bard become a lot more interesting. And also more subtly, the way that she animates is not in time with the music. She's the only character or thing in the game that doesn't move in time with the music. So she stands out from the game in this other, like, just small, subtle little way. Um, Next slide. So this is another video. There's a lot of videos. Sorry, you have to keep getting up. So when the bard is feeling scared or sad, their face and body language actually change. They sing in a whisper. So even if the player like is playing the game the same way, they can't help but feel what the bard's feeling, right? People even trying to play the game the same way, the game feels very different. And we don't change their controls or anything. We just change the way the bard's face looks and their animations and stuff. But it completely changes the way the game feels, right? And as a result of that, I think it often changes the way players will act in a scene too. Like it gives them a really strong cue for like, okay, so the character's feeling this way, and they actually will start to play a different way, even though they don't actually have to. It's totally just like an aesthetic change, not like a game state. So next slide. So over the course of the game, the story gets a lot darker, and we try to reflect that by kind of playing with the visual design. So like in later areas of the game, the camera pulls out a lot more. It looks actually a lot more like how Hollow Knight feels. You feel all the space around the character. You feel this like distance from them. The color palette gets a lot more monotone. We use a lot more right angles. So in earlier scenes where all the angles are kind of random and organic and clean feeling, they start to get very like rigid and angular and square, and that it's felt very distinctly, I guess, after going through like so many screens of random organic stuff. So okay, next slide. So like all of these are examples of rules being broken, but what I would say is the unbreakable rule is emotional consistency. And what I mean by that is I think it's really important to have your characters in your game behave and react emotionally to things that are happening in your game, things that are in and out of the player's control. And then like taking your character's emotions and basically making those the top priority, and always designing the rest of the game around being consistent with those feelings, and like presenting them, I guess, in an honest way. So like the way this was kind of our philosophy with Wandersong, and it lends itself like there's kind of a conversation between the gameplay and the character's emotions, basically. A change in one thing means that the other one reacts, right? Like when the game, when the story is sad, the player feels different, that kind of thing. I do feel like when the game really cares about the emotions of the characters in this way, the player cares more about their emotions too. It helps them connect really with like the story of the game when all these things are kind of like working together meaningfully. So next slide. Kind of another example. This was like an interesting example, I guess, of like one thing we did to kind of like help solidify that connection, that emotional consistency between the characters in the game, where I realized that it was really important always to kind of connect things that were happening in the game to the character. So and this screen kind of shows an area where the player gets like sailed around on a map. This actually went through a lot of iterations, the design of the screen. So like at first it was just going to be like a menu. You were going to like go to a boat, and then you're going to pick like a place you go to and teleport there. Then I thought, oh, actually, it would be so much cooler if you like had a boat and you could actually sail around a little screen. But on the first implementation of the screen with the boat, the characters weren't on the screen. It was just like a boat on an ocean, and you would just like steer the boat around. And what I found was that when I actually put characters on the screen, it felt like infinity times better. And it makes no sense. Like if you actually think about what I'm showing you on the screen, it's nonsense. Like why are the characters standing there? It doesn't, right? But it doesn't matter because as a player, when you connect with the characters when you see them there, and you don't ask questions about like why are they there or those kind of logical things, right? The important thing is that you're seeing their face, you're seeing how they feel in the scene, and like the context. You're seeing the characters in that context, and I don't know. Yeah, it's really valuable. Basically, I think players really appreciate when you have that. So next slide. Um, this is another thing. I don't know what the word is for it. I call it follow through. So like, and this is like it's weird. It's hard to put into words actually. This like idea. But so like using Miriam as an example, like she's not just one. She doesn't just have like one funny reaction to you when you sing to her, right? If you keep on singing to her, she actually keeps on reacting and saying new things, and you know like that's fun for the player to do. But what actually makes that interesting, the real reason to do it, is because it would have felt really weird and out of character for her to do anything else, basically, right? If you keep singing to her and she keeps saying the same thing over and over again, as a player, like you kind of like lose the sense that she's a sentient being. But you know, so like knowing that like she has this negative emotional reaction, she doesn't like you singing. I tried to basically treat that with respect, and I thought about, okay, well, if the player does keep singing to her, like what happens? Um, so basically, like when you by establishing like this like reaction that she has, this feeling and relationship she has with the bard, it would then basically mandated that you know I had to follow through on that. She had to actually like react meaningfully if you keep pushing that button, if you keep doing those things. And by doing that, like this in this little way, like it makes the world feel a lot more alive, and it feels like the world's aware the player's poking at it. And you know, it makes it feel real. It makes it make it feel like she's a real character. To me, like this also makes it feel like the game is actually really respecting the player's decisions. Basically, like it really is putting importance on like you know like you chose to do this thing, so we're gonna like give you like you know we're gonna like totally take you on good faith and like show you what happens when you do that. Basically. So yeah, uh, and I guess I should say also that like no, this is an isolated example, but like every character in the game is kind of designed with that philosophy. So like every character you can talk to, like they always have multiple lines. They never repeat a line. If they don't have anything else to say to you, they just don't speak to you again. And you know, just in every little way we could, like we always try to think and approach characters from that direction, basically. Okay, so now next slide. um, so in this part of the game, this is a video, I think the last video. The bard is actually depressed. They don't really feel like themselves anymore. And the way we changed a bunch of actually like designed things to kind of showcase that. So like in this area of the game, you don't even use singing to progress. Instead, it's like a town sim, and there's actually lots of little side quests where you have to go and talk to lots of characters, and there's a day-night cycle, so things are happening on a schedule. You have to meet characters at the right time and place to advance. It's the only time in the game where like you actually can like miss something timing-wise, and then you have to wait until the next day to do it. And it introduces this feeling of like anxiety because you're always chasing the clock. Uh, so it feels more like a normal game. It's like it basically like temporarily the game just goes into a totally different genre. But the reason why we did this kind of stuff is because it puts you so perfectly in the head of the bard at this point in the game. Like you really feel their anxiety and like the depression as they're trying to deal with all these scheduled events and then keep track of everybody. So like in cases like this where like the emotions of the game are really different from how that beginning of the game feels, like we basically exercised our freedom to just change the game really dramatically and go to a totally different genre. There's other examples, if you've played the game, where we change genre in really crazy ways that I don't want to spoil, but you can kind of see how like we could follow through on this idea in other ways too. Um, okay, so that's the whole talk. uh, yeah, sorry for stumbling a little bit. I haven't rehearsed in a little bit actually, but thank you. Okay, so I'll take questions now. Or I guess, well, okay, so the last slide just shows, yes, that's my Twitter and my name also if you want to follow me or whatever. Yeah, so person who's raising their hand.
I was gonna say it might be worthwhile if Greg has a limited view through the camera for people to go up. All right, yeah. So Greg to see who's actually there.
Yeah, I guess it actually might be better if like I don't know how you want to do it, but yeah, someone should be reading them to me because if you talk from back there, I might not hear you.
All right, yeah, I'm this guy. That's me.
How's that? Hello.
Questions in here, you can come over here.
That's also a solution. Okay, so I really like how you seem to put a lot of thought into how you made your characters feel real and feel fleshed out and feel like they have depth when you talked about how they wouldn't repeat lines. What would you say, I guess maybe besides that or in relation to that or whatever, what's the most important thing to you in writing a character or something you really prioritized when you were writing or putting together one of those characters?
Um,
I haven't played the games. I don't know how deep they are, but I intend to, and I'm curious.
I mean, the way, yeah, I guess it really, I get like besides like man, I don't know. It's like it feels like a really broad question. I keep like thabbing answers and then not finishing them in my head. The like characters always started like very, very simple, conceptually speaking. It was always like you know, there's usually there's always a dance, I guess, between like the themes of the game. Like there's always like a direction that the player needs to go into. There's always kind of like a story with the kind of part of the game that you're in, the town, or a bigger problem you have to solve. So characters always are either giving you information about that unique character, like their personality and their kind of perspective, and then also giving you information about like the bigger you know, conflict that's going on. And usually it was important for that character to have like an interesting to have some interesting relationship to that conflict. I'm not sure this is really answering your question, but I guess like
Let's keep going.
yeah. Like yeah, so if the character isn't giving you like meaningful like, you know, yeah, either basically either they should be like
I think I get what you're saying. Yeah.
yeah, if they're not portraying their personality, then I guess the next priority is always like giving information about like the bigger conflict and the bigger world around them. And usually, yeah, I would try to come up with characters that like could present an interesting like conflict with that kind of stuff too. I don't know. I don't know if that really answers your question. It's like it's honestly, yeah, it's very, very like I can't be more specific than that because every character really like I'd always come with a very unique set of like circumstances and their personality was always very specific. So like it always came down to just like, you know, like what, you know, who is this person and what's their angle and how do I present them? Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll let someone else have the chair, I guess.
Hi. So my question was kind of like having played the game, I know that there are a lot of these kind of more like the whole game is emotional, but there are these specific like parts which are particularly like heavy or like deal with or like get kind of cut to the core of something. And I was kind of curious about what your methodology was for leading up to those moments, or how do you build that moment? How do you set up that moment?
That's a cool question. I really feel like storytelling in games is really challenging. One thing for me, this actually gets to what I think is one of the hardest things about it, which is scope. So like I think for a player to develop a really meaningful connection with the character, a lot of the time it really just takes time. Like Miriam is a character who you spend a lot of time with in the game, and like the only way I really like to get to the point in the game where you can really like have these deep moments with her, it took like all of this build up, like yeah, just gradual like you know, yeah, you have to get to know her basically and spend a lot of time with her. The only way to really accelerate that is to really like I guess like the way that I approached like, you know, when looking at like the bigger structure, the bigger conflicts of the game, or how do I put this? Like you basically always want what's happening in the game to be meaningful in as many ways as possible. So like not just telling the player the plot, like moving things forward, but also trying to find really meaningful points of friction where the player can have like an interest, like learn something interesting about like another character, right? So like you know, like just hanging out with a character, just kind of like idling with them and spending time is cool. But it was really important to have the game, I guess, like kind of thrust you into situations where you know, like you challenge the characters in an interesting way that like forces them to kind of reveal something new about themselves. So like a lot of the moment to moment, like big story stuff was decided based on like honing in on that. There's always like like the way like big story decisions would be made would be like, okay, like in this chapter, I really want to get to kind of like this moment between these two characters, and then yeah, finding ways to kind of like funnel that in. I don't know if that makes sense. yeah, like, yeah, something like that.
Thank you.
All right. Hello.
Hello.
Just played the entire game last night. Loved it.
Wow.
I've I've always been personally really interested in combining like games and musicals because they're two things I've loved. I've always been like, oh, I wonder how those mechanics would work, and I never thought about it again. And then I played this game, and I was just immediately struck by kind of how you tied these ideas together. I was like, it kind of like hit me almost immediately with like the Bard's like his like I want song, the I want to be a hero song. And I was like, oh, this is like very much the kind of thing like I have always wanted to do. So I was wondering if you could talk about kind of the process of incorporating, like musical mechanics into a game that isn't just like standard rhythm stuff,
Right. Right.
I found that really interesting.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. We had a lot of good our foundation with that rainbow music wheel, I think was very, very strong. And that was really nice thing was that like from the beginning, like the very first seed was always about creating music. And so like everything in the game was designed around interacting with that music wheel in an interesting way. And I guess like I was always trying to like find new directions to push it in. So like uh in some ways actually like because that was my foundation, like there was actually a lot of friction a lot of the time. Like when all they can do is sing and the problems they're facing are like very like global catastrophe sized, sometimes it's really hard to find a reason why they have anything meaningful to add, or like that you can like as a player that you have anything that you can do, so that there was a lot of friction with that, and that was like kind of the hardest part of kind of designing those things together. But I basically tried to in a similar way to how I talked about like following through on like character habits and idiosyncrasies. Like I tried to follow through on that friction as well. The story ended up being in a big way about like, well, yeah, all you do is sing. So how do you solve these problems? And that becomes like a really big question over the course of the game. So I guess just in some, yeah, I try to like knowing that the singing was kind of like the core concept. Everything in the game that happens is always kind of like communicating with you through that. It's always, or talking about it, and because of that, like it's always relevant somehow. Like the singing is always relevant somehow, and there always was ways to like plug that stuff in. I guess I don't know. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but
Oh no, it answers my question.
yeah, yeah. It was a lot of stuff to be thinking about at the same time. The moments when like the lyrical sing-alongs, like that "I Want" song, were probably actually some of my favorites. That wasn't an idea that I had early on in the game, but I was really interested in like there were a few different ways that I approached trying to make it so that like the I wanted the player basically to feel like they were making music. So I was always trying to find ways to like even if you the problem would always be like, okay, like I want to tell this kind of story, but I also want the player to feel like they're kind of singing this and making it up themselves. So everything you see in the game is always like a solution that was trying to marry these two problems together. I think that lyrical like "I Want" song stuff is like basically one of the strongest solutions we had for those kind of conflicts. But those are like the two like that was like the box I was always working inside of, I guess, just to give you perspective on that. That's like how we landed on those. Was always like there's always these constraints that were like, okay, I want this and this. How do I do that? And then I would land on solutions like that.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm Chris.
Oh. Hi, Chris.
Hey, I was just wondering, so when I was playing the game, there's a lot of areas, and each area explores new mechanics, and there was actually way more content than I was originally anticipating. And I was wondering about how you decided, like, what types of stories you wanted to tell in terms of, like, how many areas you wanted, if that was an early story design decision, or if you wanted to explore the mechanics more.
Yeah, at the outset of the game, I think like so the story was always kind of like the first priority for this game for how things were decided. So like at the very beginning of the process, I made some decisions about like what the general journey was going to be, and like how kind of like what the big, yeah, I guess what the big themes were, and then everything else is kind of decided after that. So mechanics are always kind of like, like you know, like for the first thing would always be like, okay, like this part of the game is about this, like making the player feel like this, telling this kind of story, you interact with this kind of character. That was always like the first thing, and the mechanics are always kind of like solved to sort of like kind of like create that experience, I guess, or support that. Which is actually for me, like that was the only way I felt that I could really, I guess, like keep the story feeling like it was really meaningful. I have a very hard time if I have like a game design already decided, kind of trying to fit a story around that, because emotions are just so awkwardly shaped and like very hard to try to like, you know, like there's so many little ways that something can happen in a game that just doesn't feel right, and sometimes it's really hard to put into words. So I always would have kind of that emotional experience first as the guideline, and then the mechanics are always kind of like, for me, easier to shape and solve in such a way that they would kind of like support that instead, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, cool.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
First, I want to say I went through the whole game as much as I could, doing a little dance. That was my favorite part. But this was a game maker, right?
Yes, Game Maker Studio.
Did you ever hit a point where you thought maybe the scope was past what Game Maker could do, or were you kind of ready to build on it with the engine that you kind of did? Or like what was that?
In terms of scope, the craziest thing was all of the audio that was in this game. It just made build times go like crazy, and like Game Maker just was not super prepared for that kind of stuff. I found workarounds for some of those kinds of things, but as far as the actual like other than that, I found Game Maker totally serviceable. I mean, I really like Game Maker. I wouldn't necessarily say that like if you were, and I know you're not, but if you had like never made a game before, you were coming from total scratch and you were going to start like making Wandersong today or something, right? I don't know that I would recommend Game Maker as the engine to make this game in, but I had a lot of experience in Game Maker, so I used it because like it was easier for me to make this game in this engine that I already knew, rather than like start on a new one and not know what to do and like lose all this time trying to figure out how to do stuff. It was always easier for me to just like focus on making progress, building this thing as quickly as possible, basically. Yeah, because there was a lot of content in the game, and most of the time went into doing that kind of stuff. So the fact that I understood the engine already very well was basically like, it was really helpful for that reason. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey Greg, it's Tom.
Hello. Hi.
First of all, thanks so much for this awesome talk. There's so many really cool, very thought-provoking points in there. So you mentioned that this project was kind of a game.
9 questions, Tom?
Well, hold on, Greg. I have a long one here. There's a lot to unpack. I'll start with the first one though. You mentioned that this project was really about kind of creating a game around certain feelings. And I know a lot of games are kind of built around creating this core feeling of fun or like being in a state of flow. And I know you've worked on projects kind of like that, but I know that Wandersong is trying to elicit these other feelings too. So I'm wondering like how much like art and music and story do you have to have in place to see if you are actually hitting the emotional resonance that you want with your game? And then how did that change like the production process? Did it change, you know, how you approach gray boxing and then building out levels like that? Or like, how did that change the production and like level design aspects?
So because I was wearing a lot of hats. I was doing like animation and world design and programming and stuff. I worked with a sound designer and a musician. But in general, like all the other parts were things I were doing. So I guess, how do I put this? Like, the way that like my approach always with making this kind of stuff was always to kind of start with like a small core idea and grow outward. So actually in the process of making this game, there wasn't a lot of iteration in the way that people usually think about. Usually like a new area would start as like, you know, like a screen layout and a character and dialogue and like a simple interaction. And even when like not all the animation was in place and all the colors were totally decided or yada yada, usually like from that little idea, I would have enough of a sense to know, to adjust like what the purpose of that little interaction was, if that makes sense. So like in the Miriam like reactions you're seeing, for example, like even before audio was in, like the first thing was just like stop you singing, and she animates and she says some lines, and like even missing so many parts, like just that very first 10-minute implementation thing, like the reaction, the feeling that I wanted was already there, so I already knew it was working. And then all the other stuff was kind of like built on top, like knowing that like with that set in stone basically, right? So it was like, okay, like I like that little interaction. Now let me like animate her doing this fun thing. Oh, okay, that's cool. Oh, can we make her make this sound? Okay, that's cool. Oh, and then can we also like stop the music? Yeah, that feels really cool. Like all these things are kind of decided like bit by bit. But usually like that it always started, I know every like big thing always started as a very small specific thing, I guess. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
I'll save some of my other questions. Awesome.
Hello again. So my question was kind of about, so the game, like, while like it covers such like a wide range of emotions, but it's also just a really funny game. Like it hits all these very like really good moments, but specifically there are a lot of gags related to just mechanics, I guess. Like specifically, like I always think back to where it asks you the bard's name, and you have like a set amount of characters that you can choose from. Like, I guess I was wondering if you kind of talk a bit about crafting comedy through just like gameplay interactions and not just story.
Yeah, I mean it's like it's really hard for me to put some of this stuff into words, because like with a lot of like I guess like this I'll just say right now also, like a lot of things I'm saying right now about my process, or it's very like, because the game is done and I can look back on it, I can see shape to things I was doing, but at the time a lot of what was going on was like, I don't know, and like playing with things and just seeing how they turned out. Looking back, I can see how there was some like method to my approach, but like always in the moment, like it never feels so like, structured. And I think especially when you try to talk about like comedy and developing that kind of stuff, like even now I don't really like, I didn't have a strong method basically, but I think that the answer like that you're like a lot of the kind of that core philosophy stuff to do with like emotional consistency and like making, trying to connect the player to the character. I think that stuff actually helps a lot with delivering comedy, because the character of the bard is so strongly established that there actually is a lot of really automatic comedy to just like taking this character that you understand and putting them in a new situation or a challenging situation, or like asking them a question that you're kind of like not expecting. The way a lot of like the moment to moment ideation and process for this game felt was very oh man, what do you call it? Like improvisational. Sorry, man, not having good words today. But yeah, so a lot of the moment to moment design actually did feel very improvisational. The naming screen thing you're talking about is actually a really good example. Like I had just implemented like the ability to answer questions that like, and then like I was doing that scene and I was just like, oh, wouldn't it be funny? Like, what's the maximum number of choices? I can give you 8. And then it was like, what if you can only have like one letter for every choice and you have to spell a name? Like that whole scene that you're talking about, it was like very like decisions that were that small building up and out. And I think actually like because I was approaching it that way, like it was very funny for me. Like I was always having a lot of fun. I was always thinking like, this is such a stupid idea. What if I did this? Like, ha ha ha. I would work with like other, when I would work in the house of our sound designer and the musician. Like we would work together and we would just like have stupid ideas together and just laugh and be like, man, that would be so funny. And then we'd actually do it. Like a lot of the game kind of came out of this very like playful, just like having fun with the concept. And I think that energy is what comes through in a big way when you're playing the game, because you can feel that very like off the wall kind of style. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Greg, so I have 2 questions. The
Okay.
first is, I'm kind of curious if in the near future you might be making a game in 3D. So the first question I have. And the second question I have is, At least the pattern that I've seen in your games, even this one, you start with, I guess, what I would consider more of the mechanical aspect, right? With this, it's more music, which the music and the music wheel, and story and other stuff were sort of layered organically on top of that. Have you ever thought about, or is it not sort of consistent with your approach where you might start with a story first and then try to drill down to look for the mechanics? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. To answer your first question, no, I don't want to make a 3D game. That scares me. To answer your second question, like the ideation, like I actually would say the process you described is closer to how I approach this stuff. But like when you talk about where ideas come from, it is sometimes really hard to draw like a circle around where something starts. Like for this game Wandersong, like I can like I can keep walking backwards from that first music wheel implementation, and I can say that actually before that, I rode my bike across America. I lived on a bicycle for a few months. I had this like very inspiring world experience, and I had a lot of like kind of like big feelings and theme ideas. Like I wanted to actually make a game that felt like how Wandersong feels based on that trip. But I didn't know what that game was going to look like. And there are other prototypes I did in the months before Wandersong where I was kind of trying to chase that, but didn't feel like the first idea I had kind of fit with it. And then it was almost like I didn't at the time think of those things as being connected. I just was like, hey, like what if I make a game controller like, feel like a musical instrument? And then when I had that on the screen, like seeing how fun that was to play with, like all these other big ideas and themes I had kind of floating around suddenly felt like, oh wait, these actually can connect really well with this thing. And that was like, it was really the marriage of those two things that like was the foundation of Wandersong. But yeah, like that, like the feeling of the game, especially in that first chapter where it's just so like colorful and like rainbow wash positive, like that was like really the thing that I wanted to do most. And the music wheel was like, yeah, a found solution that fit that, and then yeah, it kind of grew from there. So yeah.
Any other questions?
Wow.
Yes. I'll just do a kind of quick, more straightforward one. Did you make that trailer yourself that we had seen in this presentation? Okay.
I
So
didn't.
what was that process like?
Well, the sound designer in the game actually made it. So she was really, really close to the project. The reason, like, if you look, like the first couple trailers for this game, I actually did edit myself. But she had experience in video editing, and she offered to do it. Well, yeah. Actually, at the time, like, what happened was like she offered to like, or it wasn't even this trailer. It was a trailer before that. She said like, oh, like I actually like editing video. Can I edit a trailer? And I was like, sure, I guess. Like, makes it easier for me. And I kind of figured like she would kind of like do like a first pass on it, and then I would look at it and I was gonna fix it up and like finish it off. But then she did like such a amazing, way better than I ever could job on the trailer that I was like, oh, I see, you're actually like way better at this than I am. And so it became like her job from then on to do that kind of stuff. So that only happened because because I put faith in her to do it. But yeah, so she did it, and she was really close to the project. She understood really well, like, yeah, the game. A big thing, I guess, for our trailer, like a guiding philosophy for us was the storytelling. So she really focused on like making sure that the arc of the trailer itself had a really, really strong narrative to it, like beginning, middle, end. There's like a low point and a high point. Like it really kind of like sells you on the whole arc of the game and shows you all. Like it's very not gameplay focused at all. If you look back at it, yeah. So like that was like a really important philosophy for us for how we approached like our trailer designs, and all our different trailers like are kind of telling a different story, or like they're showing a different aspect of the game, like a different little journey the player can have within the space of the game, if that makes sense. Yeah, so those are like two like really big ideas driving those.
And then kind of a related question is, you had mentioned that you had this really nice framework to really quickly iterate on the visuals and the graphics and kind of the overall aesthetic of the game. And I know that we work in Unity as well and have kind of all these tools that make changing color palettes and all these things very, very easy for us. And one thing we've always struggled with when we have that power is when you're creating new marketing material, putting something out and then having it look different or like changing things up because you're, kind of evolving the story or the characters, whatever it is. Like, how do you go about deciding what is ready to put out there to the media or to the press when you're still developing it and still refining it and polishing it?
Gotcha. That is a good question. I mean, like this is gonna sound a lot like this philosophy of starting small and growing out is like it's very much a guiding principle for the way that we do a lot of stuff. So when it comes to things like visual design, like the core of like using Wandersong as an example, like the core feeling and journey of the game was always the center of it. The visual design was always kind of like made to support that. And so like there always was a point where like the direction of the visual design, like there basically be a point where I knew that it was supporting the core idea, I guess. And as long as I knew that it was supporting that, then I was happy with it. We didn't go through, or I guess we did go through some iteration on the visuals, but I guess like the big like style of the game didn't really change. And as far as like marketing material stuff goes, we actually didn't we didn't use game assets for our like marketing materials. So we actually worked with a professional artist, like an illustrator who actually did like our promo art. And that hasn't changed since like our Kickstarter 3 years ago or whatever. So even though the game like little thing, like shading and lighting and whatever like details about the game were shifting, the overall feeling and the overall style of the game were consistent. And the promo art we made at the beginning still felt true to the game as it changed. If like almost like a concept that we were kind of like chasing and using our iterations to kind of try to approach. So like I guess yeah, I mean it's not like that's like an easy thing, but like having a really strong vision for the game and knowing where you're going to go with it, that helps a lot. Like in not just with marketing materials, but also with making the game as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, we might have one more question.
I'm kind of wrapping up here.
Or you just rather well?
No.
One more. Yeah, last question. This will be the last question.
Okay.
Hey Greg, this is a little bit more of like a logistical question. Like I know you ran a Kickstarter, but overall like the game took like roughly like 3 years. Like financially, like how did you support that? Like did you work on the game part-time until you found a publisher, or how did that work out?
The Kickstarter did support me for a good while. The team was really small, so that helped a lot. And then, yeah, once it looked like our timeline did go such that like the Kickstarter funds didn't cover the whole thing, that's when we started pitching. Like when we knew a few months in advance of that was going to happen, so we started pitching to publishers to kind of like get funding to finish the rest of the game. Yeah, but I mean that was it was the Kickstarter, and then it was our publisher Humble who funded us at the end there, basically. Yeah. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
That's great. Awesome. Thanks for your time.
Yeah.
All right, Greg. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. I am generally available for if you have other things you wanted to ask you didn't get to here, or you felt embarrassed or something. You can get in touch with me on Twitter if that's still up on the slides, or get in touch with me by email. You can get my contact from Frank or anybody here. So yeah, if you have more questions or you want me to look at something you're working on or whatever, I'm totally happy to do that. Just so you know. So yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah.
See you at GDC.
Yes. Great. Yeah. See you all, or some of you at GDC. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna hang up now. Bye.